He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 25 years of experience. And together, we're the Brief Brothers. We talk creative briefs, briefing, and all things advertising. We're back, Henry, and we have, I think, a fascinating topic today. It was something I came across on LinkedIn. It was a long article written by a marketing consultant in Germany named Thomas Braun. And I hope we can actually reach out to him and invite him to talk about the substance of his article, because it's a great topic. He was asking the question in response to having seen an ad, a print ad for Audi, about what is more important or the best approach to advertising, an executional approach or an idea approach. And he had a very strong opinion. So I sent this link to you and I said, what do you think? This could be an interesting topic. And it's interesting. It turned out that you actually have a fairly strong opinion about this. So with that in mind, and also because you're going to talk to us in your response about what some other advertising giants have had to say about the difference between executional and idea-based ads, one of whom is going to be our guest next week, Paul Feldwick, whom we're looking forward to having a great discussion with. So with all that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you, what was your response to Thomas Braun's column?
Yeah, I think that he penned a provocative piece with a provocative headline. The headline that he wrote was, "No idea needed. Is execution-based advertising here to stay?" And, he claims right up front in the piece that there are 2 schools of advertising, and he characterizes them, and I'm quoting directly: execution-based advertising, the ad, regardless of medium, is purely executional. It is not based on any kind of idea. And then 2, idea-based advertising. The ad, regardless of medium, is based on an idea. Its execution is often of secondary importance. So right off the bat, I have an issue with how he describes this. To me, he's describing a binary model where there's only 2 ways that an ad can manifest itself. And as you mentioned, we're going to hopefully have Paul Feldwick on next week. And I just recently digested both of his books, Anatomy of Humbug and Why Does the Peddler Sing? I have at least 6 models of how advertising works fresh in my mind based on those 2 books. I just think it's a little oversimplistic to say that people who create the ad that Braun sees as executional didn't base their ad on some sort of idea. Maybe there was an idea and maybe it was just too weak for it to come through. Or maybe we're not discerning that idea. You and I do a lot of these creative reviews and we don't have all the information, right? Like we're trying to piece it together as intelligent people that work or have worked in the industry. We don't have all of the facts of what's going on behind the scenes. We're Monday morning quarterbacking. But another kind of big problem or issue that I had with the piece is that he takes ads and he cherry picks them to exemplify what he sees as standard bearers for these 2 types of advertising, the execution versus the big idea ad. And the first one that he chooses as an execution ad is an ad from Audi, which is admittedly awful. Mm-hmm. But, based on my observation of the Audi brand over the last few years, and I actually have written a piece about Audi on LinkedIn, they're lost in the woods as a brand. I'm not talking about as a car manufacturer or as a seller of vehicles. I'm talking about what they're doing in their advertising and their communications. Mm-hmm. They've been lost in the woods for a few years. I mean, I'll remind you that they had a very successful campaign called Truth in Engineering, but one little problem happened, which was they got snagged in that Volkswagen Group scandal about emissions testing. So Truth in Engineering went out the window, and they've been really scrambling, in my opinion, ever since. So I wouldn't characterize this as a bad ad. It's not bad because it's executional. It's just bad all the way around.
Right, right. Well, I think you bring up a really good point that anytime you break things into black and white, this or that binary, you're setting yourself up for a huge problem because nothing is quite that simple.
Correct. And I think Feldwick himself says, those 6 models, we can look at ads and kind of post-mortem analyze them and see how they might work on different levels or in different ways with an audience. So I also think there's a little bit of, as I mentioned, Monday morning quarterbacking on our part, and that's okay. We're having fun. But a little bit more understanding, a little more humility, I think works. So he takes this Audi ad and he contrasts it to an ad for the Buonacani Fund to cure paralysis. And he says, quote, a great example of idea-based advertising. First of all, I'm very familiar with the Buonacani Fund to cure paralysis because it's Miami-based. Mark Buonacani is the son of Hall of Fame linebacker for the Miami Dolphins. And he actually was paralyzed in a football injury playing football for the Citadel. So I'm very familiar with this charity. But my point here is this is a different type of ad with a different objective. The Buonacani Fund is a nonprofit. It's trying to garner donations. And in that sense, it's a lot closer to a direct response ad than anything else. It has to do a lot more. Audi, despite the horrible ad, is, you could tell it's a brand ad. It's trying to shape your emotions about the brand. For example, maybe they're trying to communicate it's elegant, it's modern, it's something that you aspire to. And one ad of this sort isn't going to make or break Audi. But the idea, if you will, is that taken as a whole, these ads will help shape your perceptions and your feelings about the brand. This kind of advertising that we see in the Audi example, and I'll put all these up so that people can see them as we're talking about them. We see that with fragrances all the time. There's no big idea in many of fragrance ads. They're selling that feeling that they want you, whether it's that you're sexy, that you're powerful, that you're rich. That's basically what they're selling.
I think we can make an argument too that let's take a brand like Geico. When Geico introduced the Geico and the whole 15 minutes can save you 15%, that could be argued that it was a big idea. But then where did they go with that? And ever since, we've been seeing all kinds of fun, entertaining executions which build and support the brand.
Correct. In fact, to your point, I think some of the best advertising of all time is what Braun would characterize as executional, or maybe he should characterize it that way. He brings up in his piece the old VW campaign by DDB, which is revered, right? Like Ad Age said the Think Small ad was the greatest ad of all time, right? And I think a lot of people would agree with that. So he quotes Nick Cohen, who's a distinguished, ad person in his own right. He's the founder of Mad Dogs and Englishmen. And the quote is, there was nothing executional or flashy about the old Volkswagen ads. And I couldn't disagree more. First of all, I think the characterization is faulty because executional and flashy are two different things. The VW ads weren't flashy, but they were way more executional than what Cohen or Braun thinks they are. I go back to what made that ad what it is, or that campaign. They used sensory fonts when those weren't used back in the day. The minimalistic design, the snarky conversational tone. These are executional elements.
The white space.
Yeah, these are executional elements. These aren't part of a big idea. So it's really these things that make the whole campaign hang together as a whole and made VW distinctive. And that's how we call it in today's parlance, right? So for me, it's worth examining. Let's talk about that VW ad. I've done a lot of research on that because, again, it's considered like the holy grail of advertising. Bill Bernbach went to Wolfsburg, Germany, and visited the plant. And he remarked to his art director, Helmut Krohn, that VW was an honest car. Now, that is a big idea, right? Like, VW is an honest car. But if it were put in the hands of lesser creatives that didn't come up with the executions, right? I think that the campaign would have been forgotten to time, right? It was the combination of an idea that was a good idea with a stunningly different execution that got noticed and got people talking about it to the point that we still talk about it today.
Right. You know, I was thinking that from a creative's perspective, which is, I think, in the context of this conversation, a bit of a tangent. When we sit down to concept for an idea, we're never thinking about idea versus execution. We're thinking about what's the best idea we can come up with. I think the more experienced creatives will say, we'll recognize when our idea is probably a one-off, when it's more executional, when it might be truly a big idea, than say a more junior or less experienced creative. But we're thinking, and I think I can speak for a lot of creatives when I say, we want the best idea possible when we sit down to concept. And I don't think there's anything on a creative brief, to bring it back to our favorite topic, where you as the brief writer can say, make this a big idea. It's going to be, this is the problem that we have to solve.
I can see creatives rolling their eyes at that.
Right, exactly. It's like, no, we've got a specific problem to solve. We may be talking to a specific customer. We have some kind of, as you said, interesting tidbit, which we would otherwise call an insight. It may not be called an insight, but it's an interesting piece of information that'll help us understand who our customer is. All of these things weave together in the story that you tell in the brief, drive us, inspire us, spark the idea in us to come up with the solution. Is it going to be executional? Is it going to be an idea? We'll know it. And as I said to you in a follow-up or a previous conversation, a creative team will have 6, 8, 10, 15, 20 ideas for a specific brief. And maybe we'll bring half of those to our creative director. And as we're presenting them, we'll say, you know what, I realized this is the best idea that we have. The others are going to be more, one-offs, or I don't know if we can campaign these.
Yeah, well, you bring up an interesting point, and I think that they're almost two separate things, right? Like big idea or organizing idea versus campaignable. And that kind of brings me to my next point, because you could have a very executional campaign that is very campaignable. In the piece, Braun goes on to quote David Ogilvy, and the quote is, "If your campaign does not contain a big idea, it will pass like a ship in the night." Now, I was struck by this because I think that Paul Feldwick has this exact quote in one of the two books. And he points out that David Ogilvy in practice often contradicted the advice that he makes in his very widely read books. And I think the most famous example I could think of is the campaign that Ogilvy created for Hathaway shirts.
Right.
And so this campaign is almost as legendary to us in the industry as the one for VW. But what's really the big idea? I'll be here waiting for anybody to tell me what the big idea is. The truth is, what made this campaign famous and successful was one executional element, and that was an eye patch that David Ogilvy bought on his way to the shoot. And they put the eye patch on this model, and it made it interesting.
Yeah.
So, the idea here wasn't that Hathaway shirts are great if you're half blind, right? Like, it was truly an execution, and that spawned a bunch of more executions of the man in the Hathaway shirt. So, today, I think we're looking at advertising differently, thanks to people like Byron Sharp and Feldwick. And we know that certain advertising can work really well, even if it's just based on what they call the meaningless distinctive, whether it's a guy in an eye patch, that talking gecko that you mentioned. We need to create mental availability in the mind of buyers at the time of purchase. And I'm going to leave you with one last example that I think is another, it was an execution, and it was that Volkswagen ad, spot that ran in the Super Bowl, right? The one with the little kid dressed as Darth Vader, and his father presses the start button, and the kid thinks that he's the one that, started the car. Clearly it was an execution. It wasn't a big idea. It really is the epitome of a one-off. The technology that was featured in the ad wasn't unique to VW. But it's just an entertaining spot that makes you notice, and it makes you smile at the thought of Volkswagen. And so I ask, when was the last time you heard someone turn to someone else and say, "Did you see the big idea in that ad for insert brand name here?"
Right.
No. What they remember are executions.
Right.
It's us, the marketers, that are obsessed with justifying our work by claiming they're part of some like big, broad, strategic idea. That's not to say we don't need strategy and we don't have to have an organizing principle. But not every ad needs to be part of some gigantic philosophical answer to the problem of life.
Right. I
And
don't think just because an idea or just because an ad is executional doesn't diminish its power
or potential power.
or potential power.
There
Exactly.
are great executional campaigns, as I've talked about just now,
Right.
and there are bad ones. And there are great campaigns that you say, wow, that's a big idea, and it's executed marvelously. I think probably the truth is the best campaigns have a little bit of both, like that VW.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thinking about a car as an honest car, or justifying the weirdness of the Volkswagen as an honest car, right? Because it was weird at the time. The VW Beetle was a small rear engine air cooled car in a time where all cars were water cooled front engine behemoths.
Right. Right.
So it was a way of saying, well, this is why the car is weird. It's an honest car.
Well, we'll invite Thomas Braun from Germany to come on and continue the conversation, because I think he asks some valuable questions and you've got an interesting counterpoint. So good stuff, Henry.
Absolutely. Looking forward to having him on. Good stuff, Howard.
All right.
All right, Howard. So we're back for another creative review. And for this week, we're going to be looking at some out-of-home executions from Ziploc. You sent me a link, and it's some Ziploc out-of-home, as I mentioned, from China. So what do you think, Howard?
Well, Henry, these out-of-home are, I think, really unusual. They were produced by BBDO Shanghai for an everyday product, Ziploc. And what really grabbed my eye on this was the fact that the creatives came up with a fascinating solution for a pretty mundane product. It's a demonstration. It's a product demonstration. Just, and it makes me think about the old vacuum salesman who goes from door to door demonstrating to the 40s or 50s housewife how the vacuum works. Well, here in the setting of a packed, crowded, dense city like Shanghai, how Ziploc bags work by showing fresh fruit, fresh vegetables. I think there's a lemon tree in one of them. Three of the executions, and I don't know how many you're going to show, but three of them show the product out on the street, and one of them is below ground in the subway. So the first thing that came to my mind, besides the excellent execution, was I'll bet, and I have no way of knowing this, but I'll bet some creative came up with this idea independent of any media buy. Because you got to wonder, did Ziploc say we want to do an outdoor campaign? Maybe, that's a possibility. One of the fun things that you and I have when we do this kind of creative review is we don't have the creative brief. All we have, if we have it, is some kind of article, and this one came from an Ad Age article in their creativity section. So we're looking at this the way a consumer would look at it. But we bring obviously a little bit of expertise to this, so we can kind of deconstruct or reverse engineer what was going on. But my gut tells me some creative came up with this idea, sold the idea to the client, and they really liked it. And now look at this as an opportunity for everyday folks walking down the street to take pictures and post them on social media. The opportunity beyond the media buy, to me, seems pretty outstanding. So I like this a lot. Well done.
Yeah. So a lot of great points you made there, Howard. I think that, you look at this, the idea is almost so simple that it's one of those that you say, crap, I wish I had thought of that, right? Like,
Right.
so there's an element of that. There's also the benefit of what you said. These are like big, expensive installations to put up. But the idea isn't just about reaching the people that might see it on the street, but also the pass along value that this has, in the media and so forth. Did you see the thing, et cetera? So obviously it makes an impact in that way. You're right. We don't know the context. In theory, it's great when the creative drives the media, but in practice, as a practicing strategist on major brands, Fortune 500 brands here in the States, at least, it's often the case that the media is booked and bought well in advance of the time that I ever sit down to write a creative brief. So we're really filling inventory, and that's what they call it. That's how pathetic sounding it is. We're, filling inventory with creative work. So we don't know whether this was ideated first or they said, hey, we're going to buy these posters. And they said, well, why don't we take the poster stand and make it like a 3D activation or installation that we can capitalize on. For me, one of the interesting pieces was the one in the subway tunnel where they also bought advertising around the installation. And it was, I thought, clever, like how they brought in the pink color from the Ziploc part, the top of the bag, and used that in that more traditional out of home that's running right next to it, which I think is a case of using distinctive assets. Start to own that shade of pink, right? So that when people see it. The other thing that kind of jumped out at me, or that sparked my interest, is since I work at a multicultural agency, and this was stuff that ran or was in China, is wondering if people in China have a different relationship to Ziploc or those types of storage bags. Maybe they use different type of storage. I have no way of knowing, and I don't want to speculate, but maybe Ziploc is something that is relatively new to the Chinese audience, or they have some other type of Tupperware type containers that they tend to use. Who knows? But I wonder if this isn't also like that, to your point of it being a demo, right? Like a demo is, hey, this is how this thing works, right?
Right.
So that might be there might be something there to it. But yeah, kudos to BBDO in Shanghai. Definitely artistically, well executed, and just taking something that's as mundane as a Ziploc bag and making it larger than life and bringing it into something that's as mundane as an out-of-home poster stand and creating something from that.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.